Chapter 5 Taking the Long Way Home, in which the Grasshopper defends his definition of games by introducing a definition of efficiency. Smith is at Jones's house, I began, and is about to depart on foot for his own home. There are two routes he could take, a shorter or a longer one. The shorter route is also the more scenic, since it takes him along the cliffs and provides a spectacular view of Georgian Bay. The longer route is across flat fields of stubble. "I think I'll take the longer route tonight," Smith announces to Jones. "Why?" Jones responds. "I've decided to make a game of getting home, you see." "Jolly good," says Jones. "What's the game?" "I've just told you," says Smith. "Really, I must have missed it. Tell me again." "I said I was going to take the longer way home." "My dear fellow, that's not a game. It's a nuisance and a bore. The view is monotonous and the path is overgrown with weeds, and it will take you longer." "Precisely. That's what makes it a game." "Afraid I don't follow you." "Let me try to explain. A game is when, although you can avoid doing something disagreeable without suffering any loss or inconvenience, you go ahead and do it anyway." "Who on earth told you that was a game?" "A professor I know down at the university. He knows all about games, obviously. Actually, he didn't put it quite like that." "Aha." Smith then recites your definition to Jones, Grasshopper. "It sounds a bit less idiotic put like that, I admit," says Jones. "Now, suppose we take a look at this enterprise you want to call a game part by part and see if it fits the definition. First, you are trying to achieve some state of affairs." "Yes, the state of affairs which consists in my being home." "Right. Now, are there means at your disposal such that you can rule out some in favor of others?" "Yes, I can go either the long way or the short way." "Check. Now, have you adopted a rule which prohibits more efficient in favor of less efficient means?" "Clearly, I have ruled out going the shorter and therefore more efficient way." "And are you doing the latter just so that you can be getting home by taking the longer way around, and not for some ulterior purpose?" "I am." "You don't have an amorous rendezvous in the meadow, do you, old chap? If you do, then I wouldn't doubt that you were up to some game." "Unfortunately not. The facts are just as I have stated them." "Then one of two things must be the case." "And they are?" "Either your decision to take the long way home is a game, or your professor is wrong in believing that voluntarily choosing less efficient over more efficient means is sufficient with the other things he lists to make what you are proposing to do a game. And since you will never get me to believe that your taking the long way home is a game, I can only conclude that your professor must be mistaken in his definition." "Yes, but suppose I actually do take the long way home for no purpose other than to be doing it. Surely I would be doing something, and not just nothing at all. If I am not playing a game, what am I doing?" "As far as I can see, you would be doing something which you believed to be playing a game. What's the problem? Last night I believed I was successfully bluffing Robinson into concluding that I had aces back to back, only I wasn't. I was making a mistake." "If Smith's decision to take the long way home were a case of selecting inefficient over efficient means," replied Grasshopper, "then my definition of game playing would have shown to be too broad. For I am entirely willing to admit that the activity Smith described to Jones is not a game. But I shall argue that Smith's taking the long way home was not less efficient than his taking the short way home would have been. And that task will require me to advance what I think is a fairly non-controversial definition of efficiency. I define efficiency as the least expenditure of a limited resource necessary to achieve a given goal. I specify limited resource because if some resource is unlimited, there is no reason to say that using more of it is less efficient than using less of it would be, ceteris paribus, regardless of the purpose or purposes for which it is used. My contention is that games exhibit inefficiency, so understood, but that Smith's taking the long way home does not. Two examples should suffice to illustrate the fact that games exhibit the kind of limited resource necessary to characterize a use of means as being more or less efficient. Contestants in a foot race, for example, run fast either because they are competing against a record which limits the amount of time at their disposal. They do not have 5 minutes in which to run a 4-minute mile, or against another runner whose pace limits the amount of time at their disposal. Their goal, that is, requires that they use as little time as possible. Since that is so, it can be said that running is a less efficient means for completing the course than, for example, riding a bicycle or driving a Ferrari. Resources other than time, of course, also figure in games. I earlier observed that the disposition of the pieces at a certain point in a game of chess might be such that a player's moving a knight along a diagonal would be a more efficient way to achieve a checkmate arrangement of the pieces than would be his moving the knight in the prescribed way. What is the limited resource which permits me to refer to reduced efficiency in that example? It is, I suggest, the number of moves a player has at his disposal. For if it will take black 50 moves to checkmate white, and if it will take white 49 moves to checkmate black, then black will lose. Moving the knight along the diagonal, therefore, is a more efficient way of achieving the prelusory goal of chess, just when such a move has the effect of reducing the number of moves the player will need in order to achieve that goal. Smith's taking the long way home is not a case of using less rather than more efficient means unless time, for example, is limited by Smith. It will not do to say that time is limited for Smith on the ground that time is inherently a limited resource. It is true that time is, alas, for all of us a finite quantity. But time, or any other potential resource, should not be called an actual resource unless it is viewed in relation to some goal, and it should not be called a limited resource unless it sets a limit or limits to the kind and number of my goals. Thus, although time is a finite quantity for everyone, it is not a limited resource for everyone. For a bored person, time is a burden. For a person on the rack, it is an agony. And when time is a resource for someone, it is not always a limited resource. For a person with very few goals, there is always enough time to accomplish all of them. And a classical Stoic who, on principle, tailors his desires to fit his resources, must always, in principle, have just the right amount of time. The trouble with the Smith counterexample, therefore, is that it is not, as described by Smith, a case which exhibits a selection of inefficient means, since there is no indication that any of the means that Smith proposes to use in getting home require drawing upon a limited resource. Smith's shoe leather could be a limited resource for him, or, more plausibly, his time. But it is perfectly possible that neither of these resources was limited for Smith. He may, whatever wear his shoes suffer, customarily buy himself a new pair every month. As for time, perhaps it lay heavy on his hands when he decided to set out for home. If so, then it would be much more to the point to say that Smith was operating efficiently in killing time than that he was operating inefficiently in getting home. The counterexample may therefore be dismissed, but instead of doing so, let us recast the example in such a way that it will exhibit the kind of inefficiency that Smith's proposed game lacked. For I predict that when it is properly revised, the result will be accepted by Jones and by you, Skepticus, as a game. We must then stipulate that some resource relevant to his getting home is limited for Smith. Let us say that his time is limited, and to say that his time is limited is evidently to say that he has another goal, which also requires time for its completion, and that there is competition between these two goals for the time available. Let us say that Smith wants to get home before dark, that the sun has begun to set, and that the distance to his house is such that taking the longer way risks, to some extent, the outcome. Under these circumstances, it seems clear taking the longer way is less efficient than taking the shorter way. And if Smith has no purpose in taking the longer route aside from his wish to engage in the activity such an obstacle makes possible, I submit that he is playing a game. Specifically, he is having a race with the sun. This example also provides me the opportunity, Skepticus, to reinforce a point I made earlier. In the original presentation of the definition, I pointed out that in his invention of games, the gamewright must avoid the two extremes of excessive laxity and excessive tightness in the rules he is laying down, or else run the risk of aborting his invention. Thus, Smith's game was an abortive attempt because it did not contain any proscription of means, and the reason why it did not contain such a proscription was that time was not a limited resource. By extending the colloquy between Smith and Jones just a bit further, we can also illustrate the opposite kind of failure. For this purpose, let us suppose that the two friends have formulated for themselves the same principle of efficiency that I have advanced, and have applied it to Smith's desire to make a game of getting home. Why don't you take the long way home and try to get there before sundown? That would be a game, old chap. Impossible. Why, for heaven's sake? Because we've used up all the available game time in figuring out how to play the game. The sun has set. Very well, Grasshopper, I said. I am satisfied that my objection to your account of constitutive rules on the ground that it makes the definition too broad has been satisfactorily answered. Let me, then, launch an attack once more from the other side, and argue that that account renders your definition too narrow. That is, that there are activities which must be acknowledged to be games which do not contain any limitation whatever upon the means which are permitted to achieve a prelusory goal. I put prelusory in quotation marks because, if the objection is sound, the very distinction between lusory and prelusory goals must be abandoned. That sounds a very serious objection indeed, replied the Grasshopper. It is, I assured him.